Hi there. Welcome to Real Talk live at the barn. My name is Emilio Pardo, and I am so glad you're here. This is a very special place, the barn. So 21 years ago, we built this barn for friends and family, for conversation, for playing, for listening to music. But then slowly and gradually became a place to have a conversation about how to get through life, how to get through the week, how to get through the day. So as you can see, it is filled with memorabilia of different places that we've been and where people have brought us some trinkets from all around the world. But the real magic of this barn is the conversations and the real talk we've had here and the answers that we have found to some of our greatest problems. You see, we're going to 3 pandemics: a COVID pandemic, an economic pandemic, and a racial injustice pandemic. All 3 of these are creating havoc on our mental strength, and we need real talk to find real answers. You see, I know about real talk. I'm a cancer survivor, pancreatic cancer, but I'm also a communications practitioner that has helped many companies and organizations find answers and solutions to their problems. Now, we want to open up this barn and have real talk and pair you up with experts that can help us find some answers and tips on how to get through the day and how to get through these pandemics. So, welcome, sit back, pull up a chair, and let's have a real conversation. Let's get started. All right. Welcome back to Real Talk and welcome back to the barn. I hope that wherever you are today, you are nice and warm. Here at the barn and on the East Coast, where we're sitting at about 27 degrees outside, and the barn is a little chilly. So if you see a little bit of smoke coming out of my breath, but it's all about being at the barn and having a real conversation. And listen, I cannot tell you how excited I am about today's program. We all know what we're going through, and we know that there's a lot of indecision, lack of clarity, and frankly, 24/7 news that continues to bombard our senses. And telling your story in a place like this, telling your story, whether you're a company, big brand X, or you are a practitioner, or literally anyone that really needs to make a transition needs to understand, well, how do I tell about my story? I can't tell you how happy I am to have 2 fantastic people, the king or the pope or whatever you want to call it of storytelling. Michael Margolis is here with us today. He's the CEO of Storied, and you're going to hear a lot more about him in a few minutes. And of course, he's going to come to the barn. And of course, Ann Herbster, also a practitioner out here extraordinaire. And Ann has been focusing in the last several quarters on how do you tell your personal story? How do you break it down and understand the obstacles that you have? And frankly, how do you get through them? And how do you use the medium that you have available to you? And many times, that may not be an online medium. That may be a more traditional medium. But here is the stat that I wanted to give you to start the show, just to get us into this thinking. This is a study that just came out this week, where 68% of all the respondents, this is nationwide, all around the United States, feel defeated by 2020. Look, I don't know about you, but this year has been extraordinary, shall we say. So I thought, let's focus on something that can help break through some of this mess. But there's a lot more going on. In the same study, 63, that they were asked, what are the top events that have left you feeling exhausted, right? I mean, whether you're a parent trying to teach kids now all of a sudden, or my favorite is, when you're sequestered in the house, it's what's for dinner, what's for lunch, and what's for breakfast. But COVID has created an enormous wall and filter to have to penetrate in order for your story to resonate and actually, frankly, be realistic and relevant. 45% said that that the presidential election was giving them an exhausting state of affairs. 35% spread the whole concept of misinformation on COVID. You know, it takes a PhD just to figure out how to get through some of these misinformations all over the place, and they happen to be coming to you very close to you at places where you live and work every day. And then lastly, as I mentioned, the 27 news cycle, which doesn't seem to stop. It is absolutely constant. So with all of that said, let's have a real conversation about what it takes to have a story, a strategy for your story, and how do you find that inward energy to not just tell your story, but how to shape it, how to make it authentic. So with that, let me bring to the barn the one and only Michael Margolis. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Emilio. It's awesome to see you.
It's you're wearing a little bit less clothes than I am, and I am jealous. Michael, you're in LA, right?
I'm almost embarrassed to admit. I know that the East Coast is snowed under right now. But yeah, we're California dreaming over here.
Awesome. Well, Michael, I want to say a few things about you and about your endeavor. Storied is a company that you have birthed from the beginning and have created an enormous amount of advice for corporations, for people, leaders across the country, from Facebook to others that have made storytelling not only a way of life, but something very, very important and hard to craft when you have the drivers that I just talked about, right? When people are feeling exhausted, people are feeling left out. If you go to the next slide, you'll see that Michael has not only advised Facebook, you got Hulu, Genentech, I mean, you name it, Michael has been inside of these rooms. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that he focuses not only on strategy, but how do you make it real? How do you activate it? So if you're out there listening and you're a brand expert or you're marketing or yourself have your own endeavor, these three areas are very important. It's not only having the right narrative for yourself, but how do you take it and multiply it, amplify it as much as possible? And of course, training inside of an organization on how to tell your story. Telling your story, a narrative, is going to be 2021's biggest challenge. How do we tell our story? How do we tell the news story? How do we go into the news story of ourselves and our companies? And for that, there's a formula, but more than that, there's an expert that can help us. Michael, let's go. Let's get this going. And the first question that I get asked, how do we deal with telling your story in the middle of all this disruption, and the fact of why do we need a story?
Yeah, it's a great question, Emilio, and it's so awesome to see you. And I think back to the privilege that I had in supporting you as part of your journey with AARP and Life Reimagined as well. Yes, and
we had a lot of fun with it.
We did, and I think it was very prescient, the work you were doing there and how this applies to all of us. Like, one of the ways that I've been obsessed with disruption and innovation my whole career, but in many ways, COVID, I would say, disruption just got democratized. Every single one of us has had a forced disruption, and the challenge with disruption, as the slide that you put up, is that with disruption, everybody needs a new story, and things are moving so fast, we don't know what story we're in anymore. So there's a big part of this process that I think you're really opening the door to for us to explore today is, how do we locate ourselves right now, right? Where are we?
Yeah.
right? Who are we? Where are we? Where are we going? And how do we get there? And so there's a huge element to story in an organizational and business context, as well as a personal context, which is it's really like a GPS, right? It's a location device and a transportation vehicle. And the question is, where is it going, and do we want to go there? So the last thing I would offer to this, and this is a ripe sort of touchstone for us, is the way forward in the midst of any kind of disruption is faith in the future.
Hmm. What do you
Which
mean
can
by
feel
that?
like a reckoning. Well, so like see, with disruption, things that we used to hold as true, as solid, as fundamental, the things that we could count on, some of those assumptions or truths don't hold up anymore. So how do we, in the face of that loss and that grief, that need to pivot, that need to adapt, what gives us faith in the future? And each of us has to answer that personally or organizationally.
I could not agree with you more, Michael. And, if you think about finding your place, everybody that I talk to, and I wonder what you think of this, that I talk to across every sector says, I feel like I'm in a bubble, right? I feel like I'm in a complete bubble. And is anybody out there listening to what I'm saying? So first and foremost is finding that place for you to say, okay, everybody else is going through the same thing, right? And this bubble is unique, but how do I make the best of it? How do I use this 11 by 15 screen or whatever format, right? And go, and then go from there. And it's a very powerful thing. What are you doing with corporations? As the slide says, those who tell the story can rule the world. It's about your narrative, right? It's about your story. Is there a formula that we can talk about that helps us understand how do we get there?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, I'm obsessed with how to tell the story of innovation and disruption long before COVID happened, because it's the hardest story to tell. By definition, when you're telling the story of disruption, you're overstepping. You're doing something you're not supposed to be doing. And so it brings up resistance, it brings up naysayers, the skeptics. Any of us who've been on a journey of change have eaten that shit sandwich, right? Like we have faced the heartbreak of dreams that we see of what is possible get lost in translation or misunderstood. And so and I had my own sort of struggles with this early on. My early career in the late 90s, I was a social entrepreneur, and I was working on poverty, race, and the digital divide, and had a lot of very quick success, and within a couple years, epic fail. And it was coming out of that experience, I was like, okay, there's something missing from the conversation. How do we talk about this? And one of the things that I realized is that when we lead with data and conclusions, the story is dead on arrival.
Wow.
And yet this is the religion of our time, right? Every business decision making is driven by data and conclusions, which are an important part of the story. What we end up doing, we often work with senior leaders who are trying to sell the future, create shared alignment, build velocity, working on some of the biggest, most complex issues of our time. And before you present the data, right, in the conclusions, what we have to do is help people see it and feel it in order to believe it. Right. So you see how this connects back up to faith in the future, right? Because oftentimes we're coming and we're trying to force our beliefs upon others. And oftentimes in business, we're presenting data that our audience doesn't agree with, right? Like we see this again and again, even in our political environment, right? Where we're trying to present a logical, rational argument to people about something that's actually emotional and aspirational, which is why your opening statistics about existential crisis is so important, because it is about a sense of identity, about who we are and where we're going. So yeah, there are 3 steps that's broken down in my latest book, Story 10X. That is, you have to see it and you have to feel it in order to believe it. I think it's another slide there. But that another way to think about this in simple terms, we usually think of a story as beginning, middle, and end.
You want to go to the next slide there, Stefan? There you go.
I think it's actually even the further one after that. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, even
more.
further. Yeah.
I'll
let you find it.
You got to talk about the brain. I love this graph.
We will. Yeah.
We can come back to this one.
We can. Yeah. So you want to talk about this? Great.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated with polarity. And that, oftentimes, back to faith in the future, right? Let me ask you, do leaders have to have faith in the future? What do you think, Emilio?
Absolutely. I think they must.
If a leader doesn't have faith in the future, do they belong in the seat of leadership?
Never.
So I tend to agree. And what I would say, though, is that most leaders, in some form, really care. They want to make an impact. They're driven to make a difference and to create value, but they don't tell a story that reinforces faith in the future. Instead, the story is about what's wrong, what's broken, what needs to be fixed. And what we have found is that when you start with this rhetoric, which is what we've all been taught in business school, it's sort of the dominant thinking of our time, problem solution. That's what puts people on the defensive. It's starting with what's wrong and then telling people what's right. Instead of possibility obstacle, which is all about, let's celebrate the possibilities and the opportunities of this moment, the things that we can all agree on, and then let's talk about what stands in the way. So that shift in polarity from minus plus to plus minus, again and again, when we do our storytelling trainings in every organization imaginable, we work with a lot of product managers and designers and marketers. This is game changing for them. And it's based on the feel good principle. We do the things that make us feel good as opposed to when we're feeling like we're being judged or attacked. And so much of our rhetoric and so much of the stories that leaders are telling actually is tearing us apart instead of celebrating what's right and building us back up.
Wow. About 8 months ago, the concept or the trend was, if you're a brand or a company, you need to be present now during the hard times.
Yeah.
So that we remember that's part of the story strategy that you're talking about. It's not just about here's the solution to the problem, right? What do I have to add to this narrative? And I think that applies for the individual person as well.
You know what I realized? So I think a lot about the rules of three. So beginning, middle, and end. Aristotle talked about the three rules or the three proofs of rhetoric: ethos, pathos, and logos. We can think of past, present, future. I've always built narratives around future, present, past. Like start with the future first.
Okay.
Right? And this is a really important reframe, starting with the future first, because then we have to ask ourselves, how do we use our past to legitimize that future? If we start if we start in the past, we're often trapped in the past. And I know we'll talk about this from a personal story perspective as well, and have done a lot of work in that environment too. And I know we've got another one of your friends, Anne, who's joining us too. We're going to unpack this, right? But we have to start with the future first. Now, when COVID hit, something interesting happened for me, Emilio, was instead of starting with the future, we actually, with every leader and organization we worked with, we had to actually meet people in the present, right? Because that's what you're talking about. Meeting people in the present is about actually having empathy for where people are at and being able to witness it authentically and to speak to that discomfort in the unknown. It's hard to lead with the future when you don't have visibility or line of sight on what's happening next. So there's all sorts of rhetorical ways that we help people then still solve for that amidst the unknowns. But that was a humbling lesson this year of seeing how many of us had to simply, and this is what you do when you go through trauma, right? When you go through a really hard time, it really is about just put your pants on in the morning, one leg at a time. Like eat your bowl of cereal, just slow down, focus on self-care, check in with yourself, check in with those around you. And that's really what the leadership exercise I saw every single leader I know have to do, of just like hold people tight, let's get closer together.
And I love your advice of start with the future, right? Visualize it. I use that a lot when we're doing strategy sessions about how do we get out of this problem, or how do we innovate for the future. I want to go back to the slide that was on there, because this is a huge um, opportunity here. This is the formula of storytelling. And I would say, Michael, this is universal for both a big brand like Facebook, like you have done for Facebook, or a regular person like me and you, or anybody else that is interested in how do you build that storytelling formula. But before you go there, before you talk about this one, there's a comment from one of our terrific barn stormers, Rich Feller, that he talks about how disruption is also part of the same device that someone like even Biden needs to take advantage of, right? Mm-hmm. He needs to see it, feel it. We always know his sympathy. What any thoughts there? Any pieces of advice for him before we get back to the regular person?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this presidential election, as all presidential elections is always a story, or a referendum rather, on America's story, right? That's what a presidential election is. What's the story of who we are, about where we're going, who we're becoming? And I felt actually there was a lot lost in the noise in our election cycle, because there are 4 fundamental pillars of what the story of America is right now. I think the 4 fundamental issues, one was about trust, right? It was about trust in our elected officials, trust in our government, trust in like who can we trust and believe, trust in the news, the media, all these different things, but trust in our fellow citizens. The second one was around health, right? Obviously with COVID and all the concerns that brings up. The third one was wealth, or the economy, right? And then the fourth one, right? And how do we reboot innovation, all these things. And the fourth is the American dream. And I know that's something that you're really passionate about as well, Emilio. Yeah. But the American dream is a tent revival. It's the opportunity to go back to what is our fundamental promise and ideals. Let's double down on those, and let's also be honest about the gaps. And this was part of the reckoning we also saw this summer, of looking at systemic racism and unconscious bias, and or through COVID, how the distinctions, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. It's bringing a lot of things to the surface, but the enduring promise of the American dream is still the bedrock of our country. So back to the question, my number one advice to Biden is double down on the American dream, contextualize that to the 21st century. And then also during the DNC, they had a theme that they ran through the DNC convention called We the People. And I was surprised that that was not an ongoing campaign theme, and I would strongly encourage it to be, because that really becomes the We the People. Like it goes back to the origin story, right, of the founding of America, and forgive my ignorance, we the people is either the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, but it's one of those, right? But like, what are we reaffirming? Pulling that through line forward, I love it. I think is a huge opportunity, and it's still ripe up for grabs.
Yeah, well, there's some free advice for President-elect Biden. We'll make sure that he gets it. Let's go back to the formula, because I think this is where the magic starts to come together. When you start talking about believing it, about feeling it, and about seeing it. I think that is the most succinct way that we can give our viewers a coat hanger to hang their story, right? See it, feel it, believe it. Tell us a little bit about each one of those, and then I want to bring in Ann Herbster to reflect on this from a personal perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the biggest obstacle you face as a change maker or as an innovator is disbelief. Who do you think you are? What gives you the right to be doing this? How can I actually take the leap of faith, whatever promise that you're selling me? So the first thing we have to do is sell the dream. Talk about the possibilities and the opportunities. And the best way to do this is to describe how the world has changed, what's possible today that wasn't 3 or 5 years ago. So there's the subtitle of my book is From the Impossible to the Inevitable. See, the moment you establish possibility, as that Elon Musk quote that was up a moment ago shared, once you establish possibility, now it's just a question of probability.
Yeah.
Right. So we have to first capture people's imagination and help people look at the future and think about what we can do now. Right. And then once we've captured the big picture, we then zoom in and try to get as close as possible for people to have a visceral experience of what's at stake. What are people feeling and caring about? And what's the gap between what people want and what gets in the way? And if you do that really well, then people will be begging you for the data and the evidence. Yeah, Emilio.
That's awesome. And just a word on possibility. I've done a lot of research, as you know, on language and whatnot. Possibilities is a critical word, especially today.
Yeah.
As we get older, and what we have found in the boomer population and even in the Gen X population, that as you get older in life, when you're a child, you're filled with possibilities, possible lives. You can be a nurse, you can be a firefighter, you can be a doctor, you can be a teacher. You're filled with possibilities. And as you get older, you begin to lessen and get and lose some of those possibilities, whether it's societal trends or societal norms, whatever that is. We get then to middle age and we're looking at ourselves going, my God, what is possible? I have more opportunity. I know more now. I have more wisdom. I can do it. I think the same thing is happening today. I think the lack of, or these 3 trends that I talked about at the beginning are taking away the perception that there's a possibility for me. And we need to get through that, right? And that's why I love the formula that you have of feel it. What's in the real talk environment, what is an example of each one of those, if you can? The feel it, believe it, and see it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so look, we actually have done a lot of work, as you mentioned, with Facebook, including work on their a lot of their different products, including the Groups product. And 5 years ago, Groups was lost amongst Facebook's family of apps, sort of as a second thought. Today, Groups is a center point of the future of Facebook. Every team at Facebook has a community strategy. And what we ended up focusing on there was, what is the structure of belonging in the digital age? How is that changing, and what role does Facebook and social media have to play? And I realize for most of us who are listening here, and we all have our relationship status with Facebook is complicated. Okay? But it is the biggest storytelling platform in the history of the universe.
Indeed.
This is our honor and privilege of working with them, of helping to support unlocking that potential. So the see it, right? The possibilities of Facebook is that every time you log on to Facebook, you're being invited to narrate your life story in your voice on your terms. It's narrative agency, right? This idea that everybody has a story and everybody has a story worth telling, which I know you're very passionate about, Emilio. This is literally baked into the charter of Facebook and the influence it's having on our entire planet. It's also an incredibly disruptive force, politically speaking, and it can be weaponized and all these kinds of things. But selling that possibility of the narrative power that's there, and specifically with Groups, it's that there's a shift happening. We don't just go onto social media to connect with friends and family. We're trying to find other people like ourselves that have a shared interest, life goal, going through a specific change. So we had to sell that dream and frame and articulate that, right? And then the feel it in that situation is that, how often do any of us go onto Facebook? And sometimes we think twice before we press publish on something because of what's called context collapse. Right? We post something and suddenly something that was for our coworkers, our parents, or relatives are commenting on, or some other random person who is misinterpreting what we'd put forward. right? So it brings up all of these fears of being judged or of people finding out something that we wouldn't want them to find out about. But inside of groups, you have specific context, whether you're dealing with a life-threatening illness, whether you've just moved to a new town, whether you're changing your career. So that specific context, that use case of groups is where Facebook was finding some of the most powerful, meaningful connections that were happening. And in fact, the data proved it out. So they were finding 2 to 5x level of engagement inside of groups than everywhere else in the platform. And that people were saying their lives were being changed because no matter what was going on in people's personal lives back at home, like doesn't matter what family you're born into or what's going on, but you can go online and find other people like yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So that was the see it, feel it, believe it. And being able to frame it that way had an inordinate influence in helping the company understand its DNA and how to unlock that for billions of people on the planet.
How do you, and by the way, I love Gloria's comment, Gloria Rodriguez, CEO of Comunicat, one of the leading agencies on the planet for public relations, particularly in the multicultural space. I love, you're right, Facebook is where, but go back to the formula for a second.
Yes.
What's an example of feeling it? Because that's a little woo-woo, right? But what's the example that you can give that's a good example of feeling it before you talk?
Yeah. So I'll give you a completely separate example. We worked with a educational publishing company that does a lot of work around autism and Asperger's and other developmental challenges. And through doing customer insights work, ethnographic work, talking to parents and practitioners, one of the things that we discovered is actually the following 3 numbers: 60, 30, 10. That's the magic formula. And that magic formula is that they have a practitioner has 60 minutes to evaluate a child, and then 30 days to write up a report and manage the bureaucracy that will then define and impact the arc of that child's life for the next 10 years.
Wow.
And the dilemma, see, as a parent, if you have a parent who's dealing with a developmental challenge, on one hand, you're like, oh my God, what's going on with my kid? Like, they need help. Please give me answers. And then the other side, like, wait, well, you're diagnosing and labeling my kid?
Mm-hmm.
Like, and the stigma that comes with that. So that's the empathy that they brought to this, and realizing, wow, we've always built our products for the practitioner without really thinking about what the parent experience or journey is. And how could we strengthen how practitioners talk to parents of understanding like the life-changing consequences of what happens on that 60, 30, and 10, and how those things stack up. So it's that type of a insight that leads to empathy, where you think about what people want, like the desire, and then the dilemma of what stands in the way. And dilemma is always about paradox. It's always about something that's complex, riddle to solve, which is where then our compassion can come forward to say there's not one size fits all type of answer to it.
Oh, no. And what I love about the formula is that we all in the practitioner world say believing, which is the emotional part, right? And brands need to show and connect at an emotional level, which means that you better know what your audience is feeling. And one tip, by the way, I don't know what you think of this one that I've used for see it and believing it, is that you have to put yourself in the place of that person's issue and problem. Walk one day, 2 hours around with the problem of the people that you're trying to help, whether it's a company or individuals. And then you begin to have that innate feel it, an emotional dilemma. But I want to bring in now Ann Herbster, because this is exactly where what we're seeing, that storytelling and getting involved with whatever groups you can get at the personal level is also critical and important. So we have the corporate telling your story, and then we have people like us telling your story. And Ann has been involved in that personal side of it. And Ann, welcome to the board. Welcome back.
You.
Welcome back, my friend. Thank you. Thank you for coming back. And what do you think of this this formula? What are you seeing out there? What advice do you have for those of us that are looking to tell our story, and we're going to feel it because we know what the emotion is, but how do
Yeah.
we harness that?
And I think, Michael, this has been fabulous.
Mm.
I've gotten so much out of this.
Mm.
And it's got me, a couple points came to mind as I was listening to you and thinking about this. And I think one is that as individuals, we need to think about the right platform for the right story.
Yes.
And so it does, you know, if you need to adjust to that, so that if, for example, you are out there and talking about the things you do from a business perspective, LinkedIn, if you're out there and telling stories about your family, you know, where do you go to do that? The other thing that's interesting, Neil, you and I were talking about, is this age factor here. And that boomers are definitely into Facebook. I have a 24-year-old daughter, and we were talking about tonight and what I was doing. And she said, well, you know, Mom, younger people my age, I'm young, we're into TikTok. And if you look at TikTok, TikTok is where people are sharing funny stories, unburdening, like really deep emotional stories, because they have that sense of, I can do this. It's a safe place for me to do this, even though they'll get the comments. So I think figuring out where you want to go is so important. And I think something else that you said, that I've been working with some startup companies, and it's not about, and startup individuals, people who are out, let's say, in the coaching business. It's not about what you bring. It's what your ideal client wants to hear. So as you tell that story, you've got to put, Amelia, you're right, you've got to put yourself into their shoes and say, what are their challenges? What are their pain points? And what can I do to help you? It's not about, I have the certification. I mean, that's important, but it's really about getting that right message so that you hit the right person, so that you turn on that right person who says, I want to talk to you some more.
I love that. You know, and in your world, have you, when you talk about believing it, that's a very important one. But how do you get over the fear, or maybe even writer's block? By the way, I love TikTok. Believe it or not, I think TikTok is awesome. It's just another platform, like Rich Feller says in his email. You know, for the first time in history, ever, we now have platforms that can tell our story to billions of people if we wanted to. This broadcast is a perfect example of telling a story about how to tell the story. But, you know, for the first time, matching your favorite platform feels like it's the step number one. Is that what you're finding?
Absolutely. And I think we have to think like that, because getting in front of the right people with the right story, and the group idea is absolutely right. If you're really interested in coaching, as an example, you go find some groups to learn more, to interact more, because that's the right audience. Putting something like that out to all your friends when none of them may be coaches is defeating. And you'll get frustrated because you won't get the kinds of response and the feedback that you really need. So seeing what you want to get out of this, I think, is really, really important. And then feeling that emotion that you want to be able to connect, I think, is also, it's so critical.
You know, that's a good one, feeling it. Michael, what's a good example of that you've had on the concept of feeling? Well, I'm sorry, not feeling it, seeing it.
Seeing it.
Yeah, that's different.
Like as it relates to social media, or personal story?
To telling your story, yeah.
Well, so look, the place I would really, I like to focus people's attention is what story do you have permission to tell?
Yeah.
And then the follow-up to that is, what story do you wish you had permission to tell? And you can ask that to a room full of executives, and you can ask that to an individual in one-on-one therapy. But that notion of what story do you have permission to tell? And by the way, the answer at the most fundamental default level, which plays to Anne's work, the story you have permission to tell is your own, right? Where you own your own experience, right? But ultimately, the buffer of finding our voice, and this is just as true in the biggest institutions of the world as it is to us as individuals in our own careers and path. It's about permission, and in like these issues of like what gives me the right So I often say to people, it's more important to have a story worth telling than how you tell the story. If the story's worth telling, it will tell itself. It can be rough around the edges. You can be awkward, shy, like still working out the kinks. But if the story's worth telling, the audience will give you the benefit of the doubt. They're cheering you on. They're rooting for you. And so, part of the finding the story worth telling is like, reading the tea leaves. It's so much of back to, the work both of you have pioneered with Life Reimagined, of taking stock of the journey, right? Of the experiences that we've lived and what turns us on. What do we geek out on? What are the things that make us feel alive? What are the things we're most curious about? And inviting people into our world. Like I always say to people who are going through a career job or reinvention, it's not about having the answers. All you have to have are the questions. And then if you invite your audience to go on the journey with you as you explore those questions, and the fact that you're just passionate about it, they'll, oh, great. Well, yeah, like just like with you, Emilio, right? Like any of us who so admire your vision as a brand marketer, and your passion for really looking at real talk and like understanding the fundamentals of life and what makes us or breaks us, and how that applies in the world. Like this is what brings your audience together. And right, it's not about having the answers. It's what are the questions? What do we want to explore?
No, I love that. Yeah, go ahead, Anne. Go ahead.
So I wanted to bring, you talk about permissions. One of the things we hear is people struggle with feeling they have the permission to speak, to tell that story. And even if it's about them, people struggle when it comes to talking about themselves. They can talk about family and friends and everything else. But when it comes to talking about yourself and putting that into the right context, that is so hard, isn't that? I mean, don't you see that?
I love that. Do you see that also, Michael?
Yeah, it's huge. I think that the challenge there is, I kind of go back to, I have to remind myself and others all the time that it's like the first day at kindergarten, right? Like, and I spent so much of my life being the misfit kid, like a nerd before it was cool to be a nerd. Like I was bullied in every which way. Like I was a third culture kid. I grew up in Switzerland, first 9 years, and then moved to West LA, California at the age of 9. Like, I'm still recovering. Like just this sense of just being out of place, and that fear of being judged and rejected. So here's something that worked for me as a quick formula, Emilio, when I started to experiment with social media, and that was started probably in like 2009, was I wanted to give myself some guardrails, to give myself permission to play, right? So I came up with 3 ground rules, which was everything I post needs to hit one of these 3 principles. It either is going to inspire or provoke people, right? But it's something that's like, it's generative, right? And I love curating. I'm always looking at trends and different things. So it's like, it needs to excite me before I would share it to others. I think that it might excite them. So that was number 1. The second one is that I think it might make people laugh or smile, right? Something that brings like a sense of levity into the mix. And then the third one was, I'm taking the piss out of myself. Right?
Yep.
Those became my 3 sort of first principles. And when I used those as and it didn't mean I necessarily did every post hit all 3, but as long as I could justify, okay, am I hitting one of those 3? It gave me permission to experiment and play. And because that's part of what it is. Like literally, social media is it is a story making machine, right? And you get to constantly throw something out there, and how do people respond and interact and poke the box? And and occasionally, like I run hot. Occasionally, I've been like, after an hour or 2, I'm going to go ahead and delete this post. I need to get that off the chest.
I think we've all been there. Right? We've all been there. By the way, I love the way that you have just come up with a formula, which is inspire, smile, and take the piss off.
Yeah, humility, right?
Take the piss off, smile, make me have something that makes me smile. I love it. And inspiration. That's a really good in your pocket. The other thing
Yeah.
too, guys, is what I have found in your work, it's also rooted in your purpose. And we've had several shows here about purpose and how do you so you put that North Star into the storytelling. By the way, I still have my go-to purpose written on my cabinet, and I have it on a little sticker, and it says grow and give. That's my purpose in life, is to grow and to give. And when you storytell, you are, before you even craft your narrative, and I know it's really hard, as Iris Argetta here, one of our viewers, is saying, and it's hard to do it in your personal, your personal story, because you wonder, am I going to be inspiring? Am I going to make somebody laugh? What, Anne or Michael, what examples do you have of someone that you think is a great storyteller, other than you, Michael, of course?
Oh my God.
That you look for and you say, hey, that guy knows how to tell a story or the narrative, and he's got it. But
I gotta think about
Obama,
that.
But I'll start. I think Obama has a really good grasp on believing it, seeing it, and he's got a grasp on all three of those. Anyway, what do you guys have?
Wow. I have to think about that.
Is it hard?
Yes, it's really hard.
Yeah.
Look, I think there are so many. I think there's a reason why Brene Brown resonates with people. I think there's a reason why Gary Vaynerchuk resonates with a certain demographic. There's reasons why Oprah connects. If you look across most people who are amazing storytellers, in some way, they are inviting us into their world. And we have a fundamental trust in their inherent motivations, like the thing that makes them tick. Now, some people, by the way, like take Gary Vaynerchuk, some people just allergic reaction. But for those who he's meant to serve, they feel his passion, his sense of purpose, and that he has a message that is of inherent goodness and empowerment. And so I think that's the thing, because each of us are going to resonate to different voices. But the stories and the voices we respond to are people that embody or represent who we seek to be, or what we want to become more of. Right. I think it's no accident, that like Michelle Obama's biography of becoming, like that notion of who are we becoming? Literally, the stories we tell make the world. And it's why it's important to surround ourselves with stories that build us up, that nourish us, that give us the kind of nutrition and the wayfinding we need for whatever journey we're on. It's why this year, for instance, I joined EO, Entrepreneurs Organization, because anybody listening to here, you can tell I'm a story philosopher, but with the growth of my work, I needed to become a better operator CEO. So I spend time now with a lot of other operator CEOs of fast-growing businesses, right? And I want those voices. I want to understand how they think and how they see the world. So whatever's our learning agenda or curriculum, immerse and surround yourself with the stories of people who are living the thing that you want to become.
I love it. Hey, by the way, I love Rich Feller. James Taylor sings stories to me. I love James Taylor. And you're right. He's a storyteller. He is an absolute storyteller. And, he tries to take the piss off himself most of the time. And you can ask others about that too.
Emilio, I think there were two things that really came to mind, and you're going to laugh, Michael, when I tell you this. As I was listening to you, I wrote down, I said, what are the things that when I do follow people or I read their stories, what resonates? One, that they're real, that they're not coming across as fake. Yeah. Two, that they make me laugh, which is so important. And three, that for me, they're talking about things that I can equate to, that are relevant, either from a personal standpoint or from a work standpoint. And so those are kinds of the things that I look for. And if I don't see some mixture of that, I'll just move on. And I think that realness factor is so important, and real and genuine, that people can sense that.
I love that. There's another comment here from Nathaniel. Hi, Nathaniel. It's been a long time since I've I've seen Nathaniel. And I went to high school together. And he was a leader then. He's a leader now. I love his comment. I believe that emotional intelligence is a pivotal component that it must have in this regard. And in general, I love it. Goldberg, and I've been a student of EQ for a long time. Michael, I know, and you and Ann have worked with EQ. I think that fits right in that believe it category. And if you think it, right, and also seeing it. And what do you think?
Well, I mean, it applies to all three. It's definitely around empathy, but the bigger point that I would point out that is critical for those of us who are facilitating transformational work, Emilio, is to be able to truly sit in the seat of non-judgment. And it's one of the biggest blind spots I see rhetorically all the time, back to that point of like pointing out what's wrong, what's missing. Like if you really want to facilitate transformation, we have to create psychological and emotional safety. We have to start by celebrating the feast of goodness. Like, what's here? What do we have to work with? And even if we go to, like, say, narrative therapy, which is all about one's personal story, Michael White, who's the godfather of that body of work, right? Who basically, says, look, we can't change our past, but we can change the story that we tell about it. When we discover our power of authorship, that we can re-story our experiences in our own voice, our own vernacular. And that's what we want to offer to people that we're supporting and serving as well, where when you're working with big organizations and institutions of power, there's, this year has been a reckoning around systemic racism and unconscious bias. And I do not believe that trying to tear down or recriminations of institutions of power is the way to create the fastest, most effective transformation. I think it leads to just more suffering. And that's not to make people that's not to disregard the fact that there are serious issues of justice. What I find, though, is that everybody actually, with emotional and psychological safety, are willing to widen the aperture and realize, there's ways to do this as long as we're not browbeating people over the head about who's being wrong. And but it's such an instinct in all of us to just focus on how we're different and what separates us, as opposed to reinforcing, what are the invisible lines of connection? What do we share in common?
I think we should do a real talk show on just emotional intelligence and your emotional quotient, because I think that is today one of the chemical parts of the formula. That's the real feeling and emotional part of it. Hey, Michael, I cannot let you go unless you tell us a little bit about your brain graphic, which I found so fascinating. Yeah, Stefan, if you can break that
actually goes right back to this issue.
Exactly. It goes directly to emotional intelligence and how do we deal with it. And guys, this may seem a little bit academic, but the bottom line is that in today's environment, if you don't know how to tell your story, if you're a brand that falls through the cracks of believing it, feeling it, and doing it, you are not going to get what you want out of your product. And as a person, you're not going to get that job, or you're not going to connect with the people that you're trying to connect to make something good in life, to bring something out. And that's why it's so important to get behind the curtain a little bit here and find out what are those 2 or 3 things that I can do systemically, because I'm wired this way. And that gives me confidence to tell my story. One of the comments here from Carmen Marsans, who happens to be my sister, hey sis, is that you need to have confidence that if you follow your pattern, Michael, that you believe it, it's authentic, it's inspiring, that other people are going to find it interesting. Don't worry about that part. Tell the story to yourself and feel proud of that possibility. Anyway, but all that comes into the wiring of why it's so important to understand what is happening when we're telling a story or when we're listening to a story. So
Yeah. So to this point, this is fascinating because I think what you're speaking to is part of the evolutionary leap that we're in the midst of as a species. To be quite honest, I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, and I'm fascinating about the role that stories play in our lives. And they've done some phenomenal brain research on looking at the brain when we experience a story. There are two primary hormones that are activated. Oxytocin and cortisol, right? So that's what that image was showing. And so cortisol actually is the stress hormone, fight, flight, or freeze. Oxytocin is the belonging molecule. It's what gets secreted by the body, the parents of a newborn child, when you fall in love, right? And so here's the fascinating thing. Classical storytelling are cautionary tales. Right? Classical storytelling, thousands of years ago, we used to sit around the campfire and our elders, the shaman, the priest, they told us stories of don't eat the purple berries.
Yep.
This is how we hunt the buffalo.
Yeah.
This over here is taboo. Unless you've been initiated as an elder, do not open that door, right? They told us the stories of how to be safe in what was an inhospitable world. And if you followed those rules, live happily ever after, oxytocin, big payoff. Now, fast forward to today, we live in a world where we're all in perpetual fight, flight, or freeze cortisol overload. We don't know who to trust and what to believe. We don't have trusted authority figures in the same way as before. There are very few people that truly have a bully pulpit in terms of their ability to put forward an idea or a message that will be accepted whole cloth by a population, by a tribe, by an audience. And so a lot of the work we end up doing is reversing this ratio. Less cortisol, more oxytocin. It's part of that feel-good principle. We'll build a feel-good sandwich, which is oxytocin, cortisol, oxytocin. So plus, minus, plus. You have to start by binary reaction, right? Because think of in anybody in our email inbox or social media feeds, every single time you're making a split-second decision, you're going, do I belong in this story? Is this for me? Or scroll, next, 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 right? So what we have to do is, oh, wait, this is for me. To Anne, your point, is this relevant? Is this relatable? Does it pull me in? Having people self-identify and then present some kind of conflict. But otherwise, if we're just hitting people over the head with conflict, and we're seeing this right now with COVID in our messaging to the public around, social change behavior, social marketing behaviors around, masks and vaccines and everything else, because all people have heard is cortisol, cortisol, cortisol.
That is so true. But I'm also listening to you and saying, you know what? We are wired to tell our story, but it has to be connected, right, to what we believe, and but we are wired for it. So go with confidence, and that's a little different than corporations, but it's in many ways it has the same amount of effort and the same amount of work. And I love this quote by Ira: "The great stories happen to those who can tell them."
Yeah.
We are in a world that we can all tell stories. And I just love your passion, Michael, and your beauty with words. We've learned from you on the formula. I love the concept of permission. I think that is critical. Look at it as your GPS. How do you tell your story in many ways? But I want to also bring in our intrepid producer, who is an expert in telling stories in the social media space. And Stefan, you've been listening this wonderful conversation. Any thoughts that you have from a storytelling social platforms?
Yeah, it's all about storytelling, in my opinion. It's all about really being transparent, great storytelling, putting a lot of feel and emotion into it. Me personally, my thing being a former photo editor at the New York Times for over 15 years, and a photographer, everything's about visuals in my world. So one of the things I love to do, Michael, is I love to tell stories through my pictures. You know, I believe in visual storytelling. I do, a certain amount of writing when I post things to Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. But I just had a conversation with Ross Brand, who's a very big live streamer in the live streaming world. And I was on his show the other day on StreamYard Connect, which is the platform that we use. And I was talking about that, about using visuals to communicate. And it opens up a whole nother world. I mean, I post a photo of something. I went to Saks Fifth Avenue during Christmas. I did a video of the windows and all the music. And I handheld it for 2 or 3 minutes. I posted it. It's had like 3,000 views because I was thinking, people can't get to New York and Fifth Avenue. So let me tell the story. Let me show them what's going on. They loved it. Everybody was thanking me left and right. And I did it because I wanted to make other people feel good.
Yeah, no, and that's the part 2 of the formula. Well, we're coming right on our time, Michael and Anne and Stefan. I really want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart. There's no better storytelling professor in the planet. But I also want to end with, if people want to dive into storytelling, where do they go? First and foremost, there's your book, which I hope that folks can take a look at it. And I'm going to post this also on my site. And I'll be happy to send you links to it. But on a lightning round here, if you had a chance to give a piece of advice to a regular person about taking that first step, that very first step in crafting your narrative, in crafting your story, what would be that first step that you would give an advice to?
I guess what I would bring it back to is that the heart of the storyteller is the heart of the story, right? And so, like, really take a look at what is in your heart. Like, what's the riddle you're trying to solve? What's the thing that you have so much passion and curiosity about? And again, it can be a work in progress. Invite people on the journey with you of exploring whatever that frontier, whatever that unsort of mapped path that you're navigating right now, because you'll be surprised and amazed by how many others are also navigating without a map and trying to understand the exact same riddles that you are.
I love that, Michael. Thank you. And that, by the way, that matches what Professor Feller here is saying. Do I belong in this story? I mean, that's a great question that that you have also given us in your formula. And what's your piece of advice?
Mine was, think about your audience and think about where you are, and then set your expectations accordingly. So know who you're talking to, and then you can figure out what kind of response and expectation you're going to get from them. Because I think sometimes we just throw stuff out there and then we get disillusioned and frustrated because we're not getting the kind of response we wanted when it really was the wrong group to be sharing that story with.
That is a great piece of advice. And I don't want to end this conversation. I want to keep storytelling. I'll be frozen by the time we finish here because it'll be 30 degrees out of the barn. But thank you very much. Thank you, Stefan, once again, for putting together a great show. We have our next show is going to be on how to deal with telling your story about the vaccines to the multicultural audiences. And we're working on a great show with Gloria and her agency that she that's what she does. And how do we deal with telling that story in a multicultural world, and how do we help companies put that together? So I really appreciate it. Have a wonderful holiday season. Michael, I can't wait to see you in real life. And here at the barn, if at all possible, or out there in LA.
Absolutely. It's always a delight, Emilio. I so appreciate your vision and heart, and the way in which you bring all these different worlds together. And it's been a delight to connect with you too.
I enjoyed it. It was great. Thank you, Emilio.
That was awesome. And folks, go out there and tell your story. Till the next time, this is Real Talk, live from the barn. Have fun. Happy holidays to all.